Hey everyone, this is Nathan Williams with BlackRain79.com, and I'm back here with another hand history review for you guys. So today's hand was sent to me by Alexander from Ukraine. As you can see, he's got Ace-Jack offsuit there in the cutoff in a 1 cent, 2 cent, 6-max game. And he told me this hand was played on PokerStars Zoom, so it doesn't have a ton of info on the players involved, but we do have some reads on one of the main players involved, which I'll get to in a second. So let's get right into the action here. So pre-flop, it starts with a 2.5x raise by Villain 12. Now, Villain 12 doesn't play a crucial role in this hand, so I don't have information on this, but Villain 13 does play the crucial role in this hand. So Alexander told me that this guy plays an 18-17 over 100 hands. That's VPIP and PFR. As always, those are HUD stats. If you don't know what those means, there's a link in the description below. But basically, when I see an 18-17, that is in 6-max, especially, that is a NIT. As Alexander said to me, this is a nitty player, a regular, basically somebody who is playing a fairly tight selection of hands pre-flop, and basically just they're not screwing around. They're trying to win. They're a decent regular player. Doesn't mean they're a winning player, but they're definitely not a fish. So let's just keep that in mind as we go forward here. So what should Alexander do here? What should we do here? He decides to just call, as you see there. I don't mind that decision. It's okay, I would say. It really depends on Villain 12. Now, once again, this is Zoom poker, so it's very possible that Alexander didn't have any info on Villain 12. Because as I've talked about many times on my blog and stuff especially, that's one of the drawbacks of Zoom. There's pros and cons to Zoom, but one of the cons is that it's just a lot harder to get information on people because you're playing, especially at NL2, like games like this, there are going to be 500 people in the player pool. So you might only see a player once every 80 hands or 60 hands or something. And so if you're using a HUD, for instance, it's just going to take forever to get some useful information on a player like that because you're just not seeing them very often. So it's very possible that Alexander just didn't have any information on Villain 12. So basically we're just looking at an unknown opponent here. So I don't mind the decision versus an unknown to just flat with Ace-Jack, but I think that from time to time, even versus an unknown, I'll just throw in a 3-bet squeeze here just to mix things up. But as played, it's fine to just flat there. So everybody else folds when we go to a flop. So obviously a pretty good flop of Jack-6 deuce. We got the top pair, top kicker there, so let's see how the action plays out. Villain 12 comes out for the half-pot C-bet, and Villain 13 immediately comes in for the 3x raise. So this is a pretty interesting spot actually when it's gone raise, re-raise in front of you and you have top pair, top kicker. Honestly, this is a pretty gross spot, to be honest. I mean, I think that, and especially when the re-raiser is a NIT, as we talked about before. Now, I think that in a spot like this, I think it's definitely plausible that Villain 13 has one of the few hands that beat us. There's obviously more than a few hands that beat us. There's hands like Jack Deuce, 6 Deuce, Jack 6, but I don't expect a tight player to have any of those hands. So when I talk about hands that beat us, realistically what I'm looking at here is pocket 2s, pocket 6s, and maybe pocket jacks from time to time. It's obviously difficult for him to have pocket jacks because there's one on the board and we have one in our hand. But I'm basically looking at one of those 3 hands that are the most likely that a tight player could have in this spot here. But there's also, I mean, I think that a player like that definitely could have hands like King Jack. He could have Queen Jack, hands that we are ahead of. It's possible he's got some sort of big draw. There's not really too many plausible draws, I guess, on this board actually. But anyways, I'm not feeling great about this spot here. I don't know that I'm good enough to fold, though, so I really don't mind Alexander's decision here to call. I think it's fine. But basically all I want to say is I'm not feeling, great about this spot here. It's a pretty gross spot, to be honest, overall. Let's see what Villain 12 does. He just calls. So now I'm feeling a little bit better on that turn card, but remember, if he did, well, now he definitely doesn't have pocket jacks, but so now we can narrow it down to pocket deuces or pocket 6s that are hands that are ahead of us versus those hands. Technically, this jack on the turn actually doesn't help us. Well, I mean, it does help us. It helps us potentially get to a boat on the river, but we're still way, way behind pocket deuces or pocket sixes. So we need to keep that in mind. So villain 12 checks on the turn. What does villain 13 do? So he comes in for the half pot bet. So in a spot like this, what does Alexander do? He just calls. I would agree with that decision. I don't think that with trips now, I can fold in this spot. I mean, we have outs now versus deuces and sixes. We could obviously hit an ace on the river. So there are some hands that, there are some cards on the river that save us now if he does have one of those hands that currently beats us. But again, I do think that even with a type player like this, he can have hands like King Jack or Queen Jack. I do think that villain 13 definitely has some at this point. I don't see a NIT, for instance, betting a draw here. If he was somehow betting a draw on the flop, if he was raising, sorry. So I definitely think that villain 13 has a value hand at this point. I think that any of those hands that were draws that he might have been raising with on the flop, for instance, a king, queen of diamonds, I do not think that hand on the turn now is going to bet second to act against two players on a paired board like this. So I do think that villain 13 definitely has a value hand at this point. Again, there's a couple trips hands that we're ahead of, but he has a couple full houses that are ahead of us, of course. So the decision to just call here, I think, is good. Villain 12 gets out of the way. We go to the river. So the river is okay, but it's technically not the greatest river because actually one of the hands that he could have had that we were beating is a Jack 10, which now beats us, of course. Let's just see what he does first. He does ship. Oh, another thing that is extremely important to note in this hand that I really should have mentioned before is the fact that this is deep stacked. I think that the effective stacks were 150 big blinds to start the hand. So that does change things a little bit. I don't like to get a full stack in when the stacks get deeper, unless I have a really, really strong nut hand. Now we have trips top kicker, but again, given the action throughout this hand, I think that versus a NIT here, I think I'm going to agree with Alexander's decision to lay it down on the river here. As he told me in the email, I think that he told me that he thinks that villain 13 has pocket deuces or pocket sixes a lot here, and I tend to agree with that. I think we need to I think a lot of this hand is really just boils down to player type, and you have to ask yourself, is a nitty regular at the lower stakes like this really going to be raising the flop against two players, remember, then betting again into two players on the turn, and then shipping the river slightly deep stacked with many hands that we're beating here. I mean, I think he could maybe with a king jack or a queen jack from time to time, but I think that even a lot of nits at these stakes will get gun shy on the river here, and they'll just check down with those hands sometimes. So in my opinion, I think that this is leaning pretty heavily towards a nut hand with this kind of player here, and it's a tough laydown, but I do think that this is a slightly plus EV expected value laydown over the long run against this player type. Against some other player types, I definitely would not be folding here, but against a NIT and given the range and everything we've talked about in this hand, I think that I do agree with the way that Alexander decided to play this hand. So anyways, this is this is a pretty interesting spot. Let me know what you guys think. I'd be interested in your thoughts in this hand. I think there's definitely a lot of arguments, I think, on either side in this. I think that something that's really important to remember here is that villain 13 was the preflop caller versus the original preflop raiser. It might be quite a bit more willing to get all the money in here because the original raiser is going to have aces, kings, queens, those kind of hands that might be willing to go three barrels, whereas with a preflop caller, I don't expect him to ever have those hands because I expect he would have three bet those hands preflop. So that's something to think about as well here, is that I think that his range is definitely full value on the river here, and it's just a matter of how many times does he have a trips hand that he's going to go all the way with here versus one of those boats that beats us. So anyways, super interesting spot. Thank you for sending me this hand, Alexander. Once again, let me know your guys' thoughts below on this hand and how you would have played it. Make sure you give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Make sure you also subscribe to my channel if you want to see many more hand history reviews like this. I'm putting them out roughly on a weekly basis. Lastly, make sure you download a copy of my free poker cheat sheet. It's the top link in the description below. It's a 50-page little free ebook that will give you my complete strategy on how I crush these stakes. So thanks a lot for watching, guys. It's been Nathan Williams with BlackRain79.com.